Hello there and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Pepper and today we're going to be looking at a debate between Vaush and Stefan Molyneux. This debate was suggested by David Box, a comment on one of my previous YouTube videos, so if there's anything you'd like me to cover, any particular philosophical or argumentative topics, or if there's a particular debate you'd like me to analyse, leave a comment on any one of my videos, I'll get straight back to you, and hopefully I'll get that video produced within the next week. Just to be clear about what it is I'm covering here, I'll leave links to everything down below. I watched the hour-and-a-half debate itself, and then an hour and a quarter, I think, recap of that by Stefan Molyneux. And then for balance's sake, I also tried to find commentary on that debate from Vaush. I found a half-hour video, again, all the links will be below, of Vaush providing some commentary on the debate with Stefan Molyneux. So I watched all that. Obviously, that was quite a lot of material, so I think I'll split this video into two parts. That works out well, as the debate itself is split into two sections that are very different from each other and have a lot of different things to say. Like, not many of the things I talk about in this section will apply to the next section, and vice versa. So here I'll cover section 1, which is the question of where wealth comes from, and I'll sprinkle in sort of commentary from Vaush and Stefan Molyneux that came out of their other videos as well. There were 4 main takeaways I had from the first section of debate, including their behavior throughout the debate. And the first one of those was that these guys do a lot of what I would say is like debating, but not really disagreeing, right? On the surface they're disagreeing because one guy will say something and the other guy will go, whoa, 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 what about this? But there's actually no core disagreement. I don't think their answers generally conflicted at all, and I'll show you what I mean. The question was, what is the source of wealth? So both Vaush and Molyneux, I assume without having known what the question was ahead of time, had to answer that particular question. So what Vaush does is he interprets the question as, what is an essential part of the creation of wealth? So he answers by saying that labor is the source of wealth, people put in work, and you get out wealth at the end. So that's his answer, right? It's a very general, open question, and he gives a very general, open answer, and he doesn't really say how he's interpreted the question like I did just then, but that's how he chooses to answer, and he derives a point from it, right? Which is, it's the labourers that put in the labour, so they should get a portion of the wealth back. Molyneux, meanwhile, takes the question to mean, what is the reason for the wealth that we currently have in the West and around the world to an extent compared to previous generations? So he focuses mainly on the explosion of wealth from the 1800s, after or around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and he says that there are just what he calls magic people who are very, very good at wealth production. What the introduction of free markets did in the 1800s was allowed those individuals to unlock their potential, right? You didn't have kings or a state or anything like that holding them back anymore. So what it allowed them to do was say, go out and buy some land, and if they did poorly, if they didn't grow crops, they'd be punished by the free market, but if they did well, they'd be rewarded and would be able to buy more land and grow more crops because they're just very, very good at crop production and wealth creation. Now, we find out later that essentially he presents his argument very oddly, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but his argument is essentially free markets allowed individuals to unlock their potential. That allowed for the creation of new technologies, and that allowed for a huge boom in wealth, right? So obviously he's only talking about wealth really from the last 300 years. So I'm not entirely happy with his answer here because it's not really an answer to the question, what is the source of wealth? I think Vaush's answer, if it was an essay for sure, I'd be more on board with Vaush, since he's talking about wealth in general and the essential conditions for wealth creation. Molyneux is just talking about how wealth happened to come about in the West. The only thing I want to point out that as answers, and as these guys will find out as they debate, they're not really that contrary. Like, Vaush agrees at certain points that not special, but he doesn't use the term magical people, but he agrees that you need sort of captains of industry to guide this kind of thing, and that some people will be better at wealth production than others. And on the other side, Molyneux obviously realizes you need labor to create wealth, right? If you had no labor at all, you wouldn't be able to create wealth. So they've been asked a very general question, and appropriately they've given very general answers, but then they attack the other guy for giving a very general answer. And it's like, there's not really much contradiction here. You're just shining light on different aspects of the same question. If this was a real sort of philosophical argument, what they should be trying to do is find out where they disagree and resolve that difference, right? Because it's better if we agree than disagree. But that's not true in an internet debate, right? There you need to go after your opponent, make them look foolish, make yourself look good, point out that they're wrong and you're right. So that's one of the major issues I have with section 1 of this debate. It just feels like two people that they don't have different opinions, they just have a different viewpoint on the same kind of answer. So I thought there was a real lack of actual concrete disagreement, like substantial disagreement, as opposed to just surface disagreement, which is he says this, I say that. He says this, I say that, right? There wasn't much actual disagreeing going on for the first 45 minutes or an hour of this debate. The second main point I wanted to cover concerns Molyneux, and I'll wrap up with Vaush's flaws at the end here. But Molyneux, I thought, both in this debate and his analysis for some reason, presents his view very strangely. So to recap what it is, it's free markets came about in the 1800s. This was a moral shift sort of away from slavery and serfdom and towards the rights of man and private property and that kind of thing. That kind of thinking allowed for the Industrial Revolution to take off, and that technology allowed for an increase in wealth, right? So it's a pretty simple, here's the causal story of how wealth came about in the West. But each and every time he brings it up, he just weirdly de-emphasizes the role of technology in the Industrial Revolution. I can only assume this is an optics thing. He just wants you to think about free market led to wealth, free market led to wealth. He doesn't want you thinking about free market led to tech led to wealth, because then it looks like free market's doing less of the work. I have to assume that's what's going on here, because Vaush just keeps attacking him for... Vaush just keeps saying, no, it was the Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution. And Molyneux responds, I think, quite rightly by saying, well, the Industrial Revolution didn't just fall from the sky. We need to look at what the causes of the Industrial Revolution were. He quite rightly points out that all these materials have always been here. Ancient Greeks and ancient Romans had steam engines. There's really no particular reason the Industrial Revolution didn't occur in 700 as opposed to 1700. If he just stopped de-emphasizing technology and admitted that it played a fairly major role in the explosion of wealth in the 1800s, I think he'd be a lot better off, because Vaush goes after him mostly for that, and it is a weird, I wouldn't say it's a flaw in his argument, but it is an odd presentational choice. Again, if this was an essay, I'd have to keep marking and being like, well, what about the technology? What about the Industrial Revolution? That's a really important part of it. But he just wants you thinking about free market, so he kind of leaves that out, and that does create an opening for Vaush to go after him. And optically, I think it'll work, because at least I, and I think a lot of people, will be sitting at home saying, Molyneux, why aren't you talking about the technology? That's really integral here. It would be an interesting question to ask Molyneux what he thinks would have happened if you introduced the free markets, but the Industrial Revolution didn't happen. So, for example, what if the technology that we did invent during that time was impossible? You just couldn't invent it, right? Does Molyneux think the free markets alone would bring about that huge explosion in wealth? It really, really seems like it wouldn't, and it kind of seems like it wouldn't make much of a difference to overall wealth. So I think Vaush is right to keep going after Molyneux here. I actually did begin to wonder, and this is a theme I'll return to in this video and especially the next, if this was some sort of argumentative technique from Molyneux, like he was putting in an obvious flaw so that Vaush would focus on that instead of really arguing for his own beliefs. Because Vaush doesn't argue for his positive answer, his positive beliefs at all during this first section. They fight entirely on Molyneux's ground. And I have to wonder if that's deliberate. But the fact that Molyneux in his analysis keeps doing the same thing and leaving out the technology part makes me think that in fact it wasn't a deliberate choice by Molyneux. But the interesting thing is that it does lead me on to my third point, which is that Vaush completely misses the point for a good part of this section. Like, Molyneux didn't present his argument well. And obviously I've got the luxury of sitting at home and being able to pause and think, well, what was he saying there? But Vaush just refuses to give any charitability to Molyneux's side of the argument. Vaush keeps just pounding on the Industrial Revolution as the explanation of the explosion in wealth, and Molyneux just keeps saying, but why didn't it happen earlier? Why did the Industrial Revolution happen when it did? And Molyneux's answer is, of course, a turn towards free market capitalism. Vaush just doesn't get it. He just seems completely flabbergasted that Molyneux is talking about magical people. And he just keeps on saying, no, it was the Industrial Revolution that did that, the Industrial Revolution. I'll leave references below, but this is all sort of around the half-hour mark. Vaush, just by the end of it, Vaush looked pretty foolish and argumentatively weak. Molyneux points out one time, I can't remember if it's in the analysis or in the debate itself, that Vaush is tacitly agreeing with him because he talks about wealth producers and people that are very good at producing wealth. So Vaush just doesn't get the argument that Molyneux is putting forward. And although Molyneux did present it quite badly, after a certain point, Vaush should be getting it, and he's really not. He's not getting the simple chain of free markets led to industrial revolution, led to wealth. Therefore, free markets and the individuals that it frees up are the cause of wealth. Vaush just won't have it and isn't giving a substantial counter argument. He just doesn't seem to understand what the point is. My fourth and final point is that both guys were way more unfair to each other than they were to themselves. So one guy would propose a sort of general rule of thumb, like labor creates wealth, and the other guy would act as though he was proposing some iron rule and try and find counterexamples to it to break that. So I'll try to provide a couple of examples here to show what I mean. Molyneux is trying to make the point that moral changes, like the turn away from slavery, help boom the Industrial Revolution, because since people didn't have slaves to rely on anymore, they'd have to find machines to do the work for them instead, and so they turned to the Industrial Revolution, where before they never needed to because they had the slaves. And then Vaush will say something like, but they had labour-saving devices in ancient Rome. And it's like, yes, no one's saying they didn't or wouldn't. No one's saying if you have slaves, you don't need any labour-saving devices. Just as a general rule, if you have slaves, you won't bother looking for them because you're not the one doing the work anyway, right? What do you care? Molyneux does this too. Around the half-hour mark, he says something like, I guess people just worked a lot harder from the Industrial Revolution, which is his counter to Vaush, because he thinks Vaush is saying the explosion in wealth must be due to an increase in labour, and Vaush is obviously saying that the technology made labour easier. So Molyneux also generalises and strawmans, and they do pick each other up on strawmanning occasionally. So it's kind of just... It's bad arguing and it's quite bad behaviour. It's around this time Molyneux starts getting like really arsey with Vaush. Vaush I thought actually did quite well to keep his temper through some of this. Molyneux is clearly trying to wind him up. And from Molyneux's later analysis, I get the feeling that Molyneux knows he's trying to wind Vaush up. There were points, I'll go into it more in the second half. There were points where he was playing Vaush like a fiddle. Like, I think he's a fan of the channel and he knows just what buttons to push to get Vaush going. So yeah, that was a big problem in general, was that both their answers were vague, necessarily vague to fit the question, but the other guy didn't treat it as though their answer should be vague. They wanted hard, iron laws of wealth production. It's like, no one's going to come up with that. You need to be more charitable to each other. But then there'd be less debate. I do wonder if that's a deliberate tactic by the moderator, the guy asking questions, to ask a deliberately vague question so that there'll always be some sort of semblance of debate. Like if you ask them a hard, set, closed question, it might be more difficult to do that. It's kind of like bear baiting, but the bears are really into it. So for section 1, I want to announce a winner. I'll give a general overall winner at the end of my second video. But for now, I just want to say that although I was primarily more inclined to agree with Vaush, and although on paper I thought his answer was better, if it was an essay I think it would get a better mark, I think Molyneux won the debate. He tried to wind Vaush up at points, which isn't good argumentative practice. I mean, it works well, but you shouldn't do it. I thought that paid off well for him. I thought Vaush was flustered. Vaush, very oddly, despite obviously being strongly opinionated, he didn't really seem like he had a stable ground to launch his criticisms and defend himself from. He spent very little time explaining his own answer and his own view. All the time was spent discussing Molyneux's view, and that really helped him out because Molyneux can just spend more time answering Vaush's criticisms, which allows him to finesse the argument and improve it. It's like, okay, you think this is wrong with my answer, well, I'll improve it in this way. But they spent no time talking about Vaush's, so Vaush's answer just, was it good, was it bad? I don't really know. Vaush didn't really explain it. Vaush at various times in the video would talk about like great inventors, and it's like, well, hang on, aren't they the kind of magic people that Molyneux is talking about here? So Vaush he just didn't seem to present any positive arguments for his thesis, his answer to the question. Molyneux did, like, because we spent the whole time talking about Molyneux's view, so he kind of inevitably came off the better. To wrap it up, I thought the three main problems with Vaush were that he got too aggressive with Molyneux about his answer being general, even though we were expecting a general answer. And Molyneux did that too, but I thought it was worse with Vaush, and I thought he got flustered because he was angry. The second main problem was that he just did not get the causal story that Molyneux was presenting, and he didn't criticize it well. He didn't give a good reason for being baffled by it. He just did his whole Vaush, I'm baffled by this, I don't understand it type thing. And it's like, well, either try and understand it or criticize it, but don't just write it off. And the third main problem was that he spent no time putting forward his own views. We spent all our time on Molyneux's ground, and Molyneux got to refine his answer because of that. Molyneux's main problem was undoubtedly putting forward his own view in a really weird way. I don't know why he de-emphasized the Industrial Revolution, but overall, I mean, it was a general answer to a general question. I thought Molyneux did well. If I'm going to mark them out of 10 for internet debating, it was close. I don't feel like Molyneux slaughtered Vaush. I'd say Molyneux probably gets a 7 and Vaush a 5. Like, Vaush was, he's a good debater. He knows what he's doing, but there were just errors there that just brought him back down to an average in the end, because he kind of got done like Tim Pool did in the previous debate. He ended up almost being an interviewer, just asking Molyneux questions that Molyneux was mostly able to deal with. So Molyneux gets a 7 for a capable performance with an answer that I didn't really like, and I thought a better opponent would have gone after him harder on certain things. So that's it for part 1. I've covered section 1 there. Next time I'll be covering section 2. I'll be asking the question, is Vaush a hypocrite and does it matter? Because that's the main topic of discussion for section 2, so that's some really interesting stuff there. I'll also be including a few more notes about their general behaviour throughout, and announcing who I thought won the debate overall. Molyneux's ahead right now, but if Vaush has a fantastic performance in section 2 and just blows Molyneux out of the water, then I think he can bring it back, so fingers crossed, eh? Until next time, thanks again to David Box for suggesting this video. If you have any suggestions for other videos or debates you'd like me to cover, then just leave a comment down below. Like the video if you like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for regular updates. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.